The information shared in this episode is not intended to serve as a substitute for mental health services and is only intended to provide education and information to you, the listener. Thank you for joining the Honeybee Podcast. Today, I have the good fortune of sharing space with Dr. Whitney Owens, who will be providing information and education concerning the many benefits that we could expect from practicing yoga. Whitney Owens is a licensed psychologist and a certified yoga teacher. Dr. Owens received her PsyD from the Illinois School of Professional Psychology. Her practice is located in Henderson, Nevada. She specializes in working with adults with anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and addictions. Dr. Owens teaches mindfulness skills and meditation in her private practice. She has created individualized meditations for practitioners all around the world. She is trained in dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, as well as cognitive behavioral therapy. Dr. Owens is also certified in Baptiste Power Vinyasa Yoga, Yin Yoga, and is a facilitator for Eat, Breathe, Thrive. Without further ado, here is Dr. Owens. Thank you so much for joining the Honeybee Podcast. I have the good fortune of sharing space with Dr. Whitney Owens. Dr. Owens, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
I'm very happy to hear that. And thank you so much for joining the conversation today. I have already read your biography, and folks know a lot about you. And I think that it would be wise for this particular piece of our chat to start out with you explaining to our listeners your training in yoga.
I would love to. So, I am a licensed psychologist is my first passion in love, and I came to yoga probably about 5 years ago just as a student. And being a student of yoga, I learned so much about just really connecting to the body and was just really inspired by it. In fact, a funny story I like to tell is that one day after taking a class, I went up to my teacher and I said, "Do you know or have you done a course in acceptance and commitment therapy?" And she said, she laughed at me and she's like, "No, I teach yoga." And it was funny because at the time I was like, oh, like the world of psychology, is the expert on psychology and humanness, right? And then through my practice of yoga, I've learned quite more and a little bit different. But so through my practice, I was really inspired to do more training in yoga, initially wanting to just deepen my practice and deepen my understanding of the yogic principles. And so I completed 300 hours in a form of yoga called Baptiste yoga. And it is a vinyasa yoga practice. So, Baptiste yoga in particular combines the practice of meditation, asana, which is the physical practice of yoga, and then inquiry, which is also a part of yoga, the yogic principles of learning to know yourself and learning to understand yourself. And so, in addition to that, I did another 200-hour yoga teacher training through Z Flow Yoga. And I've also been trained in Yin Yoga, which is a slower form of yoga. And I'm also a facilitator for a group called Eat, Breathe, Thrive, which is a series that was developed to combine yoga and good education on learning how to use yoga and mindfulness to connect to your body. So for folks who have some eating disordered kind of concerns or body image concerns, they would sign up for one of those series to learn how to love and connect to their body in a compassionate way. So that's a lot. And that's how I came to be in yoga and sort of my training.
I think it is a beautiful thing that your journey with falling in love with yoga began with your interest in practicing the approach yourself. And then somewhere along the way, you became inspired to not only learn it for yourself, to deepen your practice, you are also intentional about sharing this beautiful gift with other people who want to experience yoga. So I do appreciate the overview of your journey. And I noticed that you had mentioned something about one of the trainings that you had taken, Dr. Owens, included yoga practices, of course, and meditation. In the past, I completed a few podcast episodes where I educated listeners on, the different states of mind, like wise mind, emotional mind, rational mind, and had a component of mindfulness.
Mm.
And I think for many of us, for many of the listeners, I'm sure, in addition to myself, there is this correlation between the concept of mindfulness and meditation. So, circling it back to something you had said, one of your educational trainings included yoga practice with the additional component of meditation. So, making a very long question more simplistic, would you consider yoga a mindfulness practice?
Yeah, yoga at its core is a moving meditation. And we can sort of use the words mindfulness and meditation kind of interchangeably. There certainly are different types of meditation that are more geared towards, achieving a Zen like state where you're not really particularly focused on any one thing. Whereas, mindfulness is particularly focusing on one thing and creating the practice of focusing your attention. But for the most part, they're very similar practices, meditation and mindfulness. And at its core, yoga is a mindful practice. Yoga can help improve what we call proprioception, which is noticing where your body is in space, right? So when we're practicing asana and moving our bodies on our mats, I always joke with my yoga teachers that I teach and that I train that essentially yoga teachers are playing Simon Says, right? And just like with children, Simon Says is a game that helps children kind of not only get really good at listening and focusing in on listening, but it also can sort of teach where your body is in space. And so with yoga, if I'm cueing a student to move their hand to the middle of the mat, right? Like let's say if they're in plank pose and I say, move your right hand to the middle of their mat, they're gaining some good proprioception of where their body is in space on their mat. It also develops what we call interoception, which is that inner awareness of what's happening inside of your body. So when we get really good through the practice of yoga at connecting with the breath and getting really intimately familiar with what's happening with your breath from moment to moment. Is your breath shallow or is it deep? Where is it landing in your body? Is it sort of caught in your throat or do you have nice big belly breaths? You start to notice that inner awareness of what's happening in the body. And that can translate to starting to become really aware of what's going on with your blood pressure or knowing what's happening in your digestion. Are you feeling more bloated or are you feeling, kind of more regular? And so through the practice, there is that mindful connection, especially to the body. And through the practice of mindfulness, getting really good at noticing what your thoughts are. And that can happen on the mat too. I always tell my students that one of the things that I was always really impressed with is that as a psychologist, I love talking, like talk. Like I talk to death, right? And I love talking to my patients. But what I learned through my yoga practice was that there were some insights that I was able to gain on my mat that I would never have gotten to by just talking about it. Because when you show up on your mat and you're kind of doing the practice of yoga, you start to notice patterns in your way of being and patterns in the way that you show up, right?
Mm.
And one of the things I noticed in my own practice was when something didn't happen the way I expected it to, like for instance, I was expecting that the teacher was going to go from one pose to the next pose I thought I knew, and then I didn't. And my inner experience of that was frustration and annoyance. Right. And then I got curious about that. And I said, well, why am I annoyed? She's the one teaching the class. I'm not teaching the class. And so I was able to develop some insight into like, sometimes I get frustrated when things don't go the way I think they should go. And I don't know that like, going through just traditional psychotherapy, if I would have understood that pattern, had I not seen it continually showing up on my mat.
And that's an interesting piece for me to piggyback on. I remember being in a couple of different trainings where one of the suggested treatment approaches for clinicians to encourage their clients or their patients to practice is the art of yoga. And my understanding, and I think that you could speak more to this, my understanding of yoga and the beneficial effects that it has on the brain, in addition to noticing those behavioral tendencies or the emotional tendencies that you had just mentioned, Dr. Owens, is also to create some regulation in the brain, like to kind of help the brain relax and to pay attention on purpose to things that we would miss if we didn't quiet the mind or be present with our body. So, this might be a kind of a weird question. And if you can speak to it, awesome. If not, no big deal. What has been your personal experience, in addition to any educational experience that you had during trainings, about yoga being a benefit to brain functioning?
Yeah, so I can speak a lot to that. And honestly, in most yoga trainings, yoga, it's funny because in the world of yoga, people don't care so much what's happening in the brain. They care about just their, like their experience, right? Like, and so most of my research and most of my interest in what's happening in the brain has really come more from the world of psychology and my training in that. And so, as I mentioned earlier, in regards to proprioception and interoception, we start to get a little bit more mindful about what's happening in our body. And part of that mindfulness is noticing the impact of the yoga on the body, right?
Mm.
So, what we know is that more vigorous practices of yoga, or even just more vigorous kind of movement, like taking a 30-minute walk, doing some cardiovascular exercise, what we know is that movement really kind of releases endorphins and other really feel good kind of chemicals in the brain that actually help with depression, and it helps with modulating emotion. So, when people are feeling more depressed, getting movement in their body and getting that, what we would call in the world of psychology, those activating behaviors, right? We kind of want to get the brain a little bit more activated. The brain is in kind of a state of depression, right? In a state of like not enough energy happening in the brain, if you will. And so the practice of yoga, if you do more intense styles of yoga, that's going to really kind of kick up your activation in your brain. For anxiety, right, the brain tends to be a little overactive.
Mhm.
And so in the world of yoga, we can use things like breath work. So in yoga, we would call that pranayama. And so we would use breath work to decrease the stimulation happening both in the brain and the body. So I'm sure you've heard of the idea of your sympathetic nervous system kind of getting really activated. This will happen with anxiety, it'll happen with trauma sometimes.
Right.
And that's our fight or flight or freeze response. And so when somebody's either in a state of trauma or they're in a state of anxiety, our goal is to take them from this sympathetic nervous system reaction of fight or flight or freeze. And in the practice of yoga, through breath work, through calming the mind, we can get to that state of rest and digest. And we do that through breath work. We do that through mindfulness of noticing where you're activated in your body, where you're holding tension, right? Because the body and emotions are not two different things. Our emotions live in our body. And the more that we can apply the practice of yoga and mindfulness to the body, we start to notice where emotions are showing up in the body. So, not sure I answered your brain question specifically, other than, right, like part of the practice of yoga and meditation is developing such a relationship with the body that we're able to start to notice, do I need more energy? Am I feeling depressed? Do I need to do some practices to get my blood flowing? Or like, is my body already really activated and I need to do some practices to try to calm it down?
That is a gorgeous answer. And I appreciate the description as to how one can be intentional about noticing what they need in the moment and how one can get there through the practice of yoga. I love it. Thank you so much. And so, to be fair and to be honest and realistic, I'm mindful that for many of us, it may be challenging to get to a yoga studio, whether that be due to restrictions in financial resources or transportation or access in general to going to a yoga studio. So, Dr. Owens, could you share with our listeners three ideas or however many ideas you're willing and able to share on what one can do to practice yoga with restricted resources?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're mentioning that, Bina, because it is true. I think, just like a lot of other kinds of forms of fitness, but especially yoga, right now it's a really booming industry and there's yoga studios popping up on every corner, but they are quite expensive. And so for your average person who is interested in learning yoga, the cost of joining a studio or going to a studio can be pretty prohibitive. But the good news is that there are tons and tons of resources out there that are completely free. One of the biggest ones would be going on to YouTube or kind of doing a Google search for yoga. YouTube is a great one. You can get a lot of different videos that you can follow at home. If you go to, kind of a more public place that has Wi Fi, but also the availability to move, right? So, like if you go to a public library or somewhere like that that has YouTube and you can gain some access there, you can kind of learn the videos, look at the videos, learn some of the breath work from watching those videos. That's one option. Here in Las Vegas, where I'm based, there are always free yoga events all around town. And it takes sort of looking on social media and, going to different yoga sites on social media to kind of find them. But once you start getting connected in the social media with yoga, literally everything that comes up on your feed will be yoga. And so, finding free events around town is another really great way to kind of keep up your practice, experience yoga in your body, and start to know. The other possibility, which is one of my mentors, this is how he got started in yoga, was he went to the library and rented any books or videos that he possibly could. And he just consumed the information in written form first and practiced at home through like reading about poses, reading about shapes, and reading about the benefits of yoga. And so he just kind of developed his home practice first before ever experiencing it in a studio. So there's lots of different ways to access it that doesn't have to be going to a studio. And in fact, I think sometimes secretly doing your yoga at home for many people initially can feel like a safer way to get started. For those who experience a lot of depression or those who experience, the need for more community, I think joining a studio is really helpful, or being a part of a studio is really helpful for that connection and community. But again, you can find that in the free classes around town. And what you start to notice is that when you start to show up to some of the free events around town, you'll start noticing similar faces, and the same kind of people tend to show up to those events, which really allows for you to create community from that.
That is outstanding. You have provided so much valuable information to our listeners as well as to myself today. And I typically like to ask my guests to identify a kernel of truth or a nugget of wisdom about whatever we're speaking of. You have provided so much, Dr. Owens. I don't know if there is additional kernels of truth or nuggets of wisdom that you can offer, but if there is, please share with us one of those things.
One of my favorite things that I like to say is that we are born with one body and we have that body throughout our entire lives. And I think that in our culture, we are so disconnected from our body. I work in the world of eating disorders, and in our culture, we focus a lot on what the body looks like rather than developing a loving relationship with the body. And if you develop a loving, connected relationship with your body will develop a loving connection with you too. And the more that we get really good at getting in tune with what our body's wanting and needing, what our heart is wanting and needing, that typically leads to a lot more overall happiness and satisfaction in our bodies and in our minds.
Perfectly stated. Thank you so much, Dr. Owens, for your time. I could keep you on the line with me forever. However, I know that that is not realistic and not what we planned for. So, again, thank you so much. And for our listeners, I will be mindful to have all of Dr. Owens's contact information, the events that she has going on, and other goodies available to you all in the show notes. Dr. Owens, have a marvelous day.
Thank you.
That was an informative, enlightening, and pleasant conversation with Dr. Owens. One of the many valuable things that I have taken away from my chat with her is that there is always a way to practice yoga even when one cannot make it to a studio. To learn more about Dr. Owens, please check out the show notes. I have all sorts of ways for you to connect with her and learn more about her practice as well as her expertise as a yoga teacher. And while you are on the internet checking out what Dr. Owens is up to, please go to my website, myhoneybeetherapy.com, and check out what I have going on. Feel free to email me with any ideas, suggestions, or special requests for the show, so long as the feedback is respectful and constructive. I'm here for it, so please hit me up. Again, I want to thank you for tuning into today's episode. Until next time, peace.